So this is my favorite chapter in the whole book. It was my favorite chapter because I loved the fact that Casper, the friendly atheist, was able to shock the two ministers who took him to church. It's just very helpful to me to encounter stories like this, because we have a tendency to short circuit, to abbreviate, to summarize our thoughts, to categorize people in our lives, and we don't always see them for who they actually are or what they actually think. I know nobody else's marriage is like this, but I have a tendency to believe if, I do something that's not the best thing to do, I know exactly how Brenda's going to react. Case in point, I lost my phone on a river trip, and I spent 4 days sweating telling my wife that I had lost my phone. And I was so worried about it. And she was like, "We can get another phone." I totally misread how she would respond. And that's because, I took the beating up of myself I was doing and pushed it out on her, right? And it was me doing it, not her. So that's me being confessional, and probably shouldn't have been, at least without checking with her first. So now I'm worried about what's going to happen after church. But if we do that with the people we love and live with, how much more do we do that with people we barely know? Yes? Mm-hmm. So this is the significance of this chapter to me. And this handout has 3 practices that actually comes out of the second book, Saving Casper. And those 3 practices, I don't want to talk about them yet, but when we get to them, I want you to know that after he wrote the second book, Saving Casper, that he ended up creating a whole seminar, not the one he talks about in this chapter, but a whole nother seminar that's all about helping people get to know each other better. And it grew out of being invited to come and sit down with an unusual trio of friends, a rabbi, a Muslim imam, and a Christian and evangelical Christian pastor who had become friends in a major city. And they asked him to come and hear their story of how they developed their friendship and the work that they had done in their city to ease tensions after 9/11. And so that, that was a significant thing. He ended up writing another book about how to put into practice these 3 practices that he had discovered. And then when he had conversation with them, said they are the practices that enabled them to do what they had done. So he's written a whole nother book about that. I think this is very significant. So what I'm actually doing, I'm trying to be very upfront here and say, I'm trying to nudge Oak Ridge towards developing these 3 practices as regular habits in our own lives. Now, there are boundaries, and there are questions to ask, and there's pushback to have in this conversation. I don't want to force anything on us. I want us to walk through this in process, but that's where I'm headed with all this. So let me summarize the story in the chapter. If I leave something out that you think is important, feel free to jump in. Basically, they are in Chicagoland. They are up in the Chicago area, and they're going to visit 2 or 3 churches while they're on this leg of their trip. They're trying to be economical about the trip. And so there's a lady that lives in the area who was a minister on staff with the church, who taught Sunday school classes, but in the process of doing all of her ministry, got really burned out on church, quit going to church, and kind of hid. She ended up finding this forum, this online forum, a blog, where atheists and Christians were talking to each other that Jim and Casper had started. And she started engaging them anonymously on this blog. They ended up developing a friendship, and she ended up taking over the running of the technical ends of the blog for them. And so Jim and Helen became friends. Helen describes herself as they arrive in Chicago and meet Helen as almost an atheist. She can't quite let go of her faith, but although she has abandoned institutional church pretty much altogether. But she wants to go visit a church with Jim and Casper, and so they invite her to go. They sit down and have coffee. They get to know each other a little bit, and then they go to visit this Presbyterian church, First Presbyterian in Chicago, in a suburb of Chicago. Now, I have a good friend, actually he died last year, who was a Presbyterian pastor, who taught me the phrase, the frozen chosen, because Presbyterians have a tendency to be ultra traditional in how they do things. In fact, they fight and split over how to do things in church. We don't know anybody like that, I realize. But there are multiple branches of the Presbyterian Church, of which, if you don't know this, the Church of Christ is one. We are a branch of the Presbyterian Church. And they will literally split a church over, a particular style of doing something in worship. So they're very, very conservative and very rigid in their liturgy. It has to be the same way all the time. So as they go to this church together, that Helen invites them to go to, Helen, who has walked out on traditional Christianity, and Jim, who is still very much involved in evangelical Christianity, expect to be bored out of their minds, and they are, as they go through this very traditional worship service. Jim, on the other hand, Casper, on the other hand, the atheist in the group, is like the first one to grab a hymnal, stands up, sings all the songs, knows all the words, and Jim and Helen can't figure out what in the world is going on. They have no idea what is happening here. And it turns out that Casper had grown up going to church, and his mom sang in the choir and eventually led a choir and worked for a church, and that he had sat on the front row watching her and listening to and participating in, and he whispers to Jim. Jim says, "What's going on?" in the middle of the service. And he whispers to Jim, "This feels like coming home." And he's so moved by it. So the conversation happens later. Jim finds out more about Casper. You can go read the chapter about his history. They learn more. They have great interchange about it. But near the end, Helen brings up the fact, "I'm glad you liked it, but did you notice that not one person talked to us while we were at church? Nobody, here you guys are typing on your laptops, you're taking notes." They were sitting near the front, and nobody spoke to us. Lots of people saw us, but nobody. Now, people had spoken to Helen. She had a neighbor there who knew her, but none of the rest of the congregation had spoken to Jim and Casper. And so she brings that up, and so they have a conversation about the difference it would make if people just made a point of coming and talking to each other. So this ties in with where we left off last week. So I'm going to go ahead and read the front side of this handout to you. In the car, Casper and I discussed Helen's observation. In fact, not only had no one spoken to us at the inn, not one person voluntarily spoke to us the whole time we were inside their building. I told Casper that I'd love to start a seminar, one that will help churches realize that the very simple action on their part could make a very big difference in how people perceive them. "You mean the just say hi idea?" Casper's asking that. Right, I said. In fact, I think I'll call it the Just Say Hi Church Growth Seminar. Here's my idea. We tell pastors to retire all of their ushers. Casper. I bet a lot of those people would be relieved to not have to be nice every Sunday, Jim. But who would take the place of all those unusually friendly people we've encountered at the front door of every church we've attended so far? That's where the Just Say Hi part comes in, Cass. We tell pastors to find 5 to 10 people who are willing to do one simple thing every time they come to church. What's that, Jim? Just say hi, Casper. That's it. They agree to say hi to 3 people who are new to them, and then they would be done for the day. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but right now, the first time I read the chapter, I'm going, I like it. I like it. I like this idea. And then Casper says, sounds kind of canned, Jim. And I thought, yep, I don't like it. What's the difference between ushers at the door and roaming greeters? Simply perception, I said. Think about how impressed we are when anyone makes the smallest gesture toward us voluntarily. I see where you're coming from, Jim. When we were approached by Randy at Saddleback or Keith at Mosaic, it definitely made an impression. And I'm a seasoned atheist. Imagine if I were what you call a seeker. I would be very impressed if someone did something even as small as saying hi to me. It seems very small and very doable. I wonder why people need a seminar to remind them of that. And you may not have read the Mosaic story with Keith. I'm not going to go into it, but in both of those situations with Randy and with Keith, they were not assigned roaming greeters. They were people who had a real reason to come over and ask. And if you remember with Randy, it was even the most brilliant opening question for engaging conversation. Are you guys spies? Right? And that demands an explanation. No, let us tell you who we are and why we're here. And now we have a real conversation that has begun. I picked up my mom to bring her to class, and she said, I'm wondering where you're going to go with this in class, because last week you talked about getting people to go and be greeters, to, making sure people are talking to people. But this chapter kind of ends with the opposite message. And I said, you're absolutely right. But I'm not going to tell you where I'm going with the class. So let me just leave that on the table for just a second and let you talk about it. And remember to talk loudly.
Well, I thought it was interesting that Helen said, I'm not a Christian, but I'm a follower of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And I think that there are a lot more Helens out there than there are atheists, people who have just become disillusioned with organized church and have just decided to distance themselves from that, even though they still believe in Jesus.
And try to live like it. Yeah, I am going to ask for a show of hands. How many of you have a Helen in your life? Yeah.
How many of us are a Helen?
Uh-oh, wait, no. Put your hands down. We're not taking hands on that. Probably none of you, because you're all in here.
Well, not today.
Not today, yes. Some of us may have been. Some of us may be heading that way.
The term Christian is one in some circles, like if my son's a scientist, in some circles, he's not going to call himself that, because what the outsider thinks of when they think of Christian is politics. And so that I'm becoming less and less. I know that in Acts 10, they were first called Christians and Antioch and all that. But I'm becoming less and less comfortable in some circles with calling myself a Christian. I would rather call myself a follower of Jesus.
Okay,
even though I'm totally involved in it.
I'm gonna summarize and repeat that for the video.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Yes, in our society today, the term Christian has become politicized to the point that it has become uncomfortable for many people to wear that as a label because we don't want to miscommunicate who we actually are. So the term follower of Jesus has become more comfortable for us, and more people are starting to use that. I get it. It makes sense to me. Any other comments?
That's been happening, by the way, for a long, long time. I remember growing up and there was all this conflict in Lebanon, and the word Christian militia was very much familiar in the news every day. And I thought, that sounds like an oxymoron to me.
Yes. Yes. I had a crush on a Lebanese girl on my swim team when I was in high school. She had a nose like Barbara Streisand's, and I really liked it. And I remember my first conversation with her, which was a nervous conversation, talking to her about where she was from, because she obviously looked Middle Eastern. And she said, I'm from Lebanon. I was actually born in the United States, but my parents were born in Lebanon. And I said, wow, that's really cool. What's your religion? And she looked at me like I had a third eye. I'm Christian. You know what? Like, that's the majority religion in Lebanon. We don't. And that's another example of how the word Christian is seen very differently in different parts of the world. And so it's important for us to understand. Communication's a key part of this. Other comments about the chapter or what I just read? Okay, I'm going to move us on. Proverbs, chapter 27. You'll notice that there are two verses here. I almost only put verse 10. I spent some time reading and paid attention, just reminding you that I'm trying to teach us to never read a Bible verse. Always try to read things in context. Proverbs is probably the one book where, you frequently kind of Bible verses stand alone. But not in this case. These two verses actually go together, and they need to be together. So I'm paying attention better.
And that was something else Jim said that he enjoyed about that service, was they told the whole story.
Yep.
They read a long thing of scripture. So they told the story, the context, instead of, he said, preachers would just go Google search a word and pull out individual verses.
Yep. Although I will totally admit, I immediately felt guilty for all the times I've word searched. Okay. Proverbs 27, 9 and 10. Perfume and incense bring joy to the heart, and the pleasantness of a friend springs from their heartfelt advice. Do not forsake your friend or a friend of your family. And do not go to your relative's house when disaster strikes you. Better a neighbor nearby than a relative far away. I just want you to interact with that scripture for a little while. Forget Jim and Casper for a while. Just interact with that. Not all of us have lifelong friends. We may envy those who do. So will you tell us a story about a friend who made a huge difference for you, lifelong or otherwise? So you can answer that question, or you can just talk about the verse, whatever you want to say. Input.
This makes me think of what you were just saying about the word Christianity, Christians. I don't find myself shirking away from telling folks that I'm a Christian. This last part of this about talking about a lifelong friend, that kind of ties in with what that question or that thing there kind of ties in with what she was saying. I don't. I'm trying to figure out where I'm going with this. I'm not Since joining this church, I have grown tremendously in my own walk with God, my own walk with Jesus. And I think that a lot of people in this building here, you in particular, have become what I would call lifelong friends. I haven't known all you guys for my whole life, but I feel like I have. And I think you're right. People shirk away from the word Christianity, Christian, because I know for me, being a Christian used to be putting down everybody that didn't think and believe the way I believe. And I don't feel that way anymore. And I know that being here in this church and walking with all of you folks and listening to your stories have brought me a long ways in doing that. And I really feel better about it. I feel like I'm much closer to God because I have friends that I can confide in, and I don't always have to be right. I don't always have to get it right. I don't have to. I've said it before. How in the world am I supposed to help lead folks to the cross of Jesus if I'm not willing to let them open? If I'm not willing to open the door and let them in the building?
Yeah.
And for me, that's pretty big, and it's gotten bigger. You know, as I walk. I'm nearly 60 years old. It's crazy to me that I finally have. And I don't know if I got it all right, you guys, but I feel like I'm getting closer to being a Christian, you know. And what is a Christian? A person that wants to be like Christ. And that's what I want to be. I don't want to be a Christian. I want to be like Christ. I don't know how those two thoughts tie together, but I'm trying to get better at this. I'm trying to, you know, and I've done it too. I've been in this church, and I've thought to myself, I should go over and say hello to that person that is new here, and then I didn't do it. But I'll do it at Walmart or at the, you know, other places. I don't know what keeps me from doing it here. I feel like I have the personality to approach people, you know.
We agree.
Even though I'm kind of shy, you know. But I just think that it's I pray that I'm getting better at being a Christian.
We heard you out of time. So. Oh my goodness.
And I got the last word. I'll get us out of here.
We had a long prayer session. Okay, yes. Steve, go
I was
ahead.
just gonna say, the woman who was in charge of our church folk group when I was in high school, I had great parents, but there were things that I didn't feel like I could talk to them about. And I could talk to Betty about anything. And then when I went to college, my folks moved to Colorado, and I was in Virginia. My brother lived in the house we grew up in, but on breaks, I felt more comfortable going and staying with Betty than I did my brother and his friends were into things I wasn't. And she helped me through some difficult breakups and things like that.
That's
and
awesome.
To this day, we still communicate and are good friends.
All
I
right,
think everybody needs somebody like that.
that's absolutely right. And I'm sorry we ran out of time for stories, but let me at least go over the 3 practices. So let me just, the reason that they are in small caps, that's the shortened version. And if you Google, if you go to search on YouTube for Jim Henderson TED Talk, you can find a TED Talk that he does on these 3 practices. It's very good. And he tells the story about the rabbi, imam, and pastor. But so they're short. That's the way he presents them on the video, is just the part that's got small caps. In the book, it's this whole statement. So let me read those whole statements and then I'll let you go. I'll be unusually interested in others, committed to asking questions and listening with the goal of learning, not listening with the goal of getting to say something. I'll stay in the room with difference. This is what Brenda and I call hugging the porcupine. Refusing to check out emotionally no matter how uncomfortable I may be. Number 3, I'll stop comparing my best with your worst. Have you noticed anybody doing that in our society for the last 8 years? Comparing their best with the enemy's worst or their opponent's worst. I'll stop it. I'll stop comparing my best with your worst, taking the proverbial log out of my own eye so that I can take an honest look at myself. I really like these 3 practices. I hope you'll spend some time with those. Maybe we'll get back to that next week. Go over those again. I feel like we ought to have some conversation about it. Thank you very much. Let's hurry to church.